Welcome to Catholic Economics. For this week, I'm going to start off with a discussion of immigration and some Congressional Budget Office projections that I think are kind of interesting to talk about. Then I'm going to talk about the new presidential candidate that we just got a week ago. And then I'll finish talking about the GDP figures that came out a few days ago for the second quarter. I want to start off because I got a comment on YouTube asking me, why is this called Catholic Economics? And I understand that because, of course, the show used to be more a discussion of the social teaching of the church specifically, and just not really focused on current events or anything, but just talking about what the church says about different things and how economists might interpret certain aspects of that teaching and how we might apply it to different situations. But of course, right now, what I'm doing is more current events focused. But that doesn't mean I can't kind of weave in some of the other stuff. So I want to start off this one, since I'm going to be talking about immigration, specifically illegal immigration. And so to kind of begin with that, I think it's interesting to see if you just look at the catechism, because I think this whole idea of immigration policy fits within the social teaching of the church. And I think it's important stuff. And I think the Pope is wise to remind leaders of relatively wealthy, stable countries that there are people all over the place on the planet that are dealing with war and all kinds of awful stuff, and that they should be helped and welcomed in at least some cases. But at the same time, that there are other considerations that the Pope himself talks about. And so the issue that you run into is you get people who they have a political axe to grind, specifically with respect to immigration. And this is kind of a running theme for me for the last, 5 years, is that what people do is they bring their political views to the church instead of allowing their political views to be molded by the church. And this, I think, is a serious problem with immigration for several reasons, and some reasons I'll talk about later. But specifically with this issue, I think if you look at the catechism, you get a very balanced take. And I'm not a kind of person who likes this term balanced. I hate when people appeal to balance for things. Oh, we just got to balance it. And it's like, no, sometimes you got to be a little extreme, and that's okay. But in this case, if you look at the catechism, on the one hand, and I don't have references to this, just look it up. But on the one hand, you have, like I mentioned before with the Pope, you have this responsibility on the part of countries to help people that are genuine, asylees, right? That they need help. They're in desperate circumstances right then. And there's no other good option for them. And that if you have much, then you owe to those who don't. I think all those kind of basic things that we talk about, almsgiving and all that stuff, of course that applies to people from other places. So there's that component to it. The other part, though, is the catechism actually specifically says that countries have a right to manage their border, and they have a right to put expectations in place for people who enter their countries or who want to enter their countries. And so you can go online and you can see just a flurry of cases of immigrants that are here illegally in the United States committing horribly unspeakable crimes over and over and over. And the response you get from some people is, oh, well, immigrants have statistically lower crime rates, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, okay, maybe that's true, maybe it's not. First of all, anybody who enters the U.S. illegally is by definition committing a crime. So it seems silly on its face to claim that way, to make that claim that, oh, they're statistically less likely to commit crimes. Well, probably not. But even so, if you look at the victim of that crime, that person, the thing that happened to that person, whether they were murdered or something else horrible happened to them, that thing would not have happened if that person had not come into the United States. If that person had not been allowed, explicitly or implicitly, right? I'm sure there's a lot of illegal immigration that seems to happen, and the feds just sort of turn a blind eye to it. Or they just don't attempt to actually enforce the border, right? So if that person had not entered the United States, that person would not have victimized the person that they victimized. So whatever your point about statistics is, who cares? Those crimes happened and they were preventable in a very fundamental sense. It's not as if there's someone who is a citizen of the United States. And I think that gets lost in this. People are perfectly happy to talk about a citizen of some other country. Oh, well, citizens of Japan, Japanese people. But we're not allowed to talk about Americans, right? Americans there are Americans. We are a people. The people of the United States are a citizenry. We are a nation. And if it's obviously horrible if people that are American citizens commit crimes. But the thing is, it's not preventable in the sense that a crime perpetrated by someone from another country is. Because you just simply keep them out. So the Catechism, I think, gives broad leeway in a lot of ways for people for politicians and for the voters to determine what policies they will put up with. And the Pope has talked about in one of his two kind of social encyclicals, I believe it's Fratelli Tutti, he talks just pages and pages and pages of discussion about cultural preservation and respecting of other cultures. Well, if that applies to Burkina Faso and to India or whatever, well, then it certainly applies to us as well. It applies to Europe. It applies to the United States. It applies to Japan and China. It has to apply to everybody. Now, maybe people don't want to talk about that, but that's the reality of it. And managing immigration is one way of providing for cultural preservation. We do have a culture. We have a culture in the United States. Some of those things are bad about our culture. Some of those things are good. We have a Christian culture in some sense. At least the fundamentals, the basics of our culture are that way. And there's a book called The Culture Transplant. If you want to read more about this from an economist standpoint, The Culture Transplant talks about this. Talks about the movement of peoples and the effect that has on people. And of course, this is the guy writing the book is, he loves immigration. He thinks it's wonderful. So of course he's going to talk up all the positive sides of it. But of course there has to be room to discuss the negatives as well. You can actually go to my website, levirussell.com. And I think if you go to articles, there's an article that was that this guy wrote before he wrote the book that the website pulled down because the article itself was too right-wing, I suppose. So you can actually, I went back in the Wayback Machine and pulled it up and copied it and put it on my website so that you can still read it if you want a kind of a shorter form version of what he was saying rather than reading the whole book. So you can check that out too. But anyway, to get to the story, so this Congressional Budget Office, so here's the headline: undocumented immigrants, so in other words, illegal immigrants, will boost economy, lower deficit. So, of course, by saying boost economy, they mean increase GDP. And, of course, you can go into a long discussion about how poor GDP is in terms of its ability to accurately describe the well-being of the citizenry. So just because I engage in a transaction for something doesn't mean that that's the only way I can benefit from that. In fact, actually, if GDP could be lower if I was just simply helping my neighbor rather than charging them for something. And so you could go into that. And I think there's room for that. But even within what they're saying here, I think is an interesting notion. And so I'll give you a couple talking points. So number one is just the time frame that they use here. So the Congressional Budget Office will normally talk about things in terms of 10-year time frames. So whenever the Congressional Budget Office's main job is to look at policies and determine the effect of those policies on the economy over a certain time frame. And almost always they're talking about a 10-year time frame. So it's interesting that what they're doing here is they're saying the nonpartisan agency estimates a net population increase of 8.7 million immigrants illegal immigrants between 2021 and 2026. And then they have their projections on the economic effects of those immigrants between 2024 and 2034. So that's the 10-year time frame. So they're taking this immigration over this, what is that, like a 6-year period, 2021 to 2026. And then they're saying, okay, what is the effect of that from 2024 to 2034? So first of all, the number one thing you can look at here to see the problem is that illegal immigrants are not robots. They're humans, and they get old, okay? And so, of course, if you suddenly increase the prime working age population of a country, then those people are going to do jobs that, well, there's lots of things here. The work that those people do will contribute to GDP. And that increase in GDP will, because they're probably using fewer government services than they will be when they're older. Okay, so their prime working age, they're between ages 25 and 54. That's when you're going to be using the least services in your life. So if you're going to be using government services, you're going to be using more of them when you're very young and when you're very old. And so if we're just looking at the effect on the budget, which is what they're trying to look at, of course, and that's why they're talking about the deficit and all of that. Yeah, if you suddenly inject a massive amount of, because they're talking about 8.7 million people. You add 8.7 prime age working people into a country, and then you only think about the effect of those people over a 10-year period. Well, yeah, of course they're going to boost GDP and the tax base, but not boost the amount spent on services. But the problem is those 8.7 million people are still going to be here when they're 70 years old. And they're probably going to have children. And those children may very well be on services. Especially because, and I think I've recommended this before, look at George Borjas's work, We Wanted Workers. He says, look, no economist, if you talk about any other subject, no economist is ever going to deny that if you increase the supply of something, that the price will fall. So in other words, if you inject more workers into an economy, then the wage rate is going to fall. So if you have people coming to the United States working for much lower wages than the people that were there before, the situation beforehand, then they're going to do that work at a lower wage, and it's going to be more likely that the children they have over that time period are going to be on services. So I think right away you this 10-year time frame injects all these assumptions that create problems for the conclusions that the CBO is trying to make here. Yes, of course, if you inject 8.7 million prime age working people and they don't have children over that 10-year period, then they're going to boost the economy temporarily. But then everything else is going to either go back to normal or it's going to get even worse than it was in terms of the budget. Okay? And again, I'm not saying don't help people, but I'm saying you can't help everyone by importing the entire planet to the United States. That's insane, and it will never work. The other thing that they kind of bury in this article, and of course I didn't read the CPO report. I mean, it's probably like 150 pages long. I'm not going to read that. But this article in the Hill, they kind of admit at the end of the article that, the problem is that, these illegal immigrants will probably create more financial pressure, like negative pressure on local and state governments. And so, see, you have things like S-chip, which is a medical, kind of low-income medical service, again, at the state level. So if those people come and then they have children, well, a lot of that burden is going to be put on the state, financially speaking, not at the federal level. And you talk about other state programs like housing programs. You talk about things like maybe even local local issues that. So, if someone comes to the United States as an illegal immigrant, well, if they're an illegal immigrant, how are they going to buy a house and thus contribute to the sort of local and state finances from a property tax perspective? No. And so they're going to, if they have children, they're going to send their children to school, but they're not going to pay for it. And so, that's at least one possible way where the local effect, the local budget effect is really bad, but the national budget effect doesn't really get affected much. Okay, maybe they're going to pay income taxes, but they're probably not going to buy a house. If they're an illegal immigrant, they probably can't do that paperwork. And so they're not going to contribute to, in a significant way, they're not going to contribute to the tax base at the local or state level, but they will at the federal level with their income taxes and sort of general economic activity, right? If you look at a business, most of the taxes they pay are federal taxes. So anyway, the bottom line is, I think there's some ways to understand this, that it's not just sunshine and roses like they want to make it. The second thing I want to look at is it appears that Texas is kind of doing a lot of work on this front in terms of immigration for the rest of the states, and that's kind of the way I think about it. I think it's something that other states should chip in more. But the this article, and I'll just put the link to the article. There's not much in here, but basically what I wanted to do with this article is just call out the fact that Catholic Charities is, in so many ways, a horrible organization, and I hate the fact that they use the name Catholic, because I think it's just awful. Essentially, what I think these people do is they traffic people into the United States. From a nonprofit cost perspective, if you take someone from Central America and you take them all the way to the United States, if they're an asylee, right? If they're seeking asylum from their country, I don't see that it's logical that they have to come all the way up to the United States or Canada. To me, that is ridiculous. If they're seeking asylum, there's another country they could go to that would cost much less to move them to, closer to their region. Or closer to their country, like in the actual region that they're from. If they're really seeking asylum. Now, if they're economic migrants, that's a different story. And again, I think it goes back to, there's nothing wrong with the United States saying, hey, we have to, on some level, take care of our own citizens too. And if we're continuously importing more and more and more labor, we're going to depress our own wages in real terms. And so this article is about Texas, the Texas Attorney General and the Texas Governor basically trying to kind of fight with these NGOs that essentially, like I said, are trafficking people into the United States. And of course, Catholic Charities of the Rio Grande Valley doesn't want to say anything about this issue, but I think it's good that Ken Paxton, the AG of Texas, is going after this kind of thing. So shifting gears to our new presidential candidate that we have, Kamala Harris. I think it's an interesting thing to see people kind of digging into her campaign for president back in 2019 and kind of comparing the things that she was talking about. So number one that I think is really important is she was talking about banning fracking. Of course, they're trying to walk this back now. But banning fracking seems to me totally ridiculous if you're concerned about inexpensive, reliable energy. And you should be concerned about those things because there are very powerful interest groups that do not want people to have inexpensive, reliable energy. And she's one of them. So in this article I've got from the Free Beacon here, let's see. Months after she announced in January 2019 that she would run for president, Harris also co-sponsored the so-called Zero Emission Vehicle Act, a bill that would later that was later modified to include language mandating 43% of car sales electric by 2027, which is 3 years from now, and 2.5 years, and 100% are electric by 2035. So that is fully ridiculous. And what I think is interesting is you're seeing kind of a real tide shift on the electric vehicle front. In Europe and in the United States, that industry is having a very difficult time making sales. So the next paragraph here. By comparison, Biden's administration has finalized multi-pollutant emission standards, which are expected to lead to 50% of light-duty car sales being battery electric and another 13% being hybrid by 2032. So if you think about this, they wanted 56% of cars to be battery electric and 13% to be hybrid by 2032, whereas Harris wanted 43% to be electric by 2027. So a 5-year earlier time frame from her. And then essentially by the time the Biden administration wanted, 69% to be either battery electric or hybrid, she wanted 100% to be electric, only electric by then. So much more radical on the kind of transportation front, the kind of normal transportation, people just getting to work, people going to visit their friends and family, people trying to get around, people trying to live in rural or exurban types of areas or even suburban areas. And it's interesting to see because, you call it an EV mandate. Well, technically, is it a mandate? No, but it's a mandate via regulation. It's the EPA just or other organizations within the federal government just kind of setting these regulations completely arbitrarily so as to induce manufacturers to create a certain percentage of their vehicles a certain way. And there's lots to talk about with that, but I think hopefully the recent pulling back of Chevron deference is going to allow for a lot of lawsuits that are going to start to pick apart this kind of thing. And you see companies kind of turning around. You see Toyota, basically the Mr. Toyota himself coming out and saying, look, I told you guys that going all in on electric was really stupid. And we just had the recent earnings call from Ford showing they were losing like almost $50,000 per EV still. And that was the case last year. So they're losing $50,000 per vehicle. And of course, Tesla's not, but Tesla basically gets paid by other manufacturers to make electric vehicles, again, through a sort of regulatory scheme. So, it's a different story. Finally, there's another piece this one's from Breitbart, where they're talking about Kamala Harris basically casting the tie-breaking vote for the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan back in 2011, right? 2021. If you remember the bag from back then, right? The STEMI. And it's just interesting to see the ensuing inflation that just absolutely totally outweighed every dollar that any of us received for that over the last few years here. And so they basically this is just a story about that there were a lot of people, even, so-called left-wing economists like Larry Summers were saying, and I remember talking about this to my students, like back in 2022, 2023, Larry Summers told them, don't do this because it's going to be a massive, massive increase in inflation. Even worse than the 2021. I mean, the 2020 stimulus was probably going to create some inflation. This one, after this, inflation just absolutely skyrocketed. And so and for lots of reasons, I'm sure, but it's kind of interesting to see, again, people trying to put the blame on her directly for this, which, hey, somebody could have said, somebody in their party could have said, hey, look, Larry Summers is talking about inflation. There's all these people talking about inflation. It's going to be a problem. Obviously it's not just Larry Summers, but all these people are talking about inflation. This is not a great idea. We just need to kind of open up and let people do their thing. Let people go back to the way things were so they can live and they can invest. But they didn't. And, I think there are probably decent arguments the other direction. Obviously, back in 2008, 2009, the big bailouts and stuff with the banks, that didn't lead to super wild inflation. But it's a totally different thing when you just give money directly to people to consume with. That's going to be a different story than basically lightening the balance sheets of a bunch of, or I don't know what the word is, but fixing the balance sheets of a bunch of banks. It's going to have a different effect. So wild stuff. But it is an interesting kind of thing to see what they're trying to do in terms of, in terms of explaining basically that what her policy regime is likely to look like. So the last thing I want to mention is just Bureau of Economic Analysis putting out their advanced estimate for second quarter GDP. And so this is real gross domestic product, increased at an annual rate of 2.8% in the second quarter. So this is an advanced estimate. So of course there's going to be adjustments and things like that over time, over the next few weeks, and then over the next couple months they'll have updates. The third adjustment to quarter one GDP growth has it at 1.4%, which I think is actually lower. And so, 2.8% is not bad. 2.8% is not a bad growth rate at all. But I think we're going to see a little bit of a turnaround in the third quarter, mainly because of housing. And I've talked about housing the last couple times, so I'm not going to mention too much about that. But I think things are kind of starting to slow down. And I don't, obviously the accounting for all this stuff is just kind of wacky, but you see imports increasing in the second quarter. And that's not great. That's not a great look, because the idea was that we're going to be nearshoring. We're going to be onshoring all this stuff. We're going to have, all these chip manufacturers are going to be making stuff, blah, 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 blah. Well, that's a little scary if we're increasing imports at this point. We're increasing our reliance on other countries for our economic well-being. I don't think that bodes well. I don't want people to do poorly, and to the extent that GDP is an indicator of how well people are doing, I don't want that to be bad. But at the same time, I think you kind of have to be realistic about it. And, consumer spending's up. Inventory investment, business investment are up. That's all good in a sense. If people are spending money, then apparently they're feeling secure enough to be able to do that. But an increased reliance on imports, that's a little bit nerve-wracking. And hopefully that will turn around in the next couple of quarters. But I think when people start feeling pressure from house values falling, and they're going to be looking at their home value, and they're not going to be quite so enthusiastic about going out there and spending a bunch of money. So I think there's at least a good chance we could see lower growth, probably under 2%, for the rest of the year. But like I've always said, I'm not a forecaster, and I'm not a macro economist. So thanks for listening. Let me know if you have any questions, and if not, I'll see you next week.